So how can I still give the kids a chance to express themselves the way they always did in this brand new way?
Welcome to Artworks for Teachers. I'm your host, Susan Riley. I'm an educator, entrepreneur, and arts integration evangelist. Each week, we'll explore how teachers can crack the code of creativity and use it as a hidden advantage in and out of the classroom. You'll hear from authors, artists, and educators sharing their stories and their strategies for unlocking the power of curiosity and creativity. Let's get going. Hello, friend, and welcome back to another episode of Artworks for Teachers. I'm your host, Susan Riley, and today I'm bringing you back a podcast that we did several years ago, but I think it's really, really exciting even now, and I think it's needed probably now more than it has ever been. So in this interview with educator Ruth Byrne, we're going to dive into the idea of storytelling in math and art. So Ruth uses something called Froebel's gifts with her students to encourage educational play. And from that has actually explored lots of different architects that were influenced by these gifts, including Frank Lloyd Wright and Buckminster Fuller. And she brings the idea of story into her art classes through math. So lots of times we don't put those two things together. We think that they're kind of separate, right? But Ruth actually shows us how the two can come together in a really natural and beautiful way. So I'm really excited for you to hear from her today as she shares these ideas. And I hope that you'll be able to take back with you something that you can bring into your classroom later on this fall. All right, here we go. All right, Ruth, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today. It's great to have you here.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
I am just a teacher, quotes. I'm on this sort of journey to understand how kids' brains really work and really support them in whatever their brains are doing at this moment. Big listener of podcasts, big explorer. I'm currently looking a lot at Froebel's gifts and math in my art class, in both with Froebel's gifts and other materials.
So tell us a little bit about Froebel's gifts, because I'm sure lots of people are not aware of them.
Yeah, they might have had like a page in their pedagogy class that they had in college, right. But it is one of those things that if I hadn't heard it on a podcast, I would have no clue what I was listening to here. So yeah, Froebel's Gifts is a series of tangible items and works, so activities that children can do that were invented in the 1800s. And Friedrich Froebel is credited as having invented kindergarten by inventing these tangible blocks and toys and things, the first educational toys. So those gifts that he created allowed very, very young children to kind of understand concepts of whole and parts of a whole, counting. It brought them really slowly, but creatively through the idea of the world as a place that you could make sense of and tell stories about and understand through real observation. So Friedrich Froebel's 1800s invented these cool toys, basically, that kids could play with, and then structured a kindergarten around it. He kind of made a whole list of, this is what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to introduce these gifts as well to keep it really conversational. It was kind of cool. Recently, we were talking about how relationships are at the fore right now. Everybody's talking about how relationships with your students are the most important thing in your classroom. Mm-hmm. In these early manuals for kindergarten, it's all about, yes, really structured exploration of these gifts, but constantly conversing with the kids, talking to the kids, saying, kids, what do you see here? What are we talking about? Tell me a story, and really understanding them through the gifts.
Wow. So what's the difference between Froebel's gifts and an approach like Montessori, for example? Because I know a lot of people know about Montessori.
Right. So they're very similar. Froebel's gifts are hyper-focused and specifically about these sort of math concepts, although they do get into ideas about community and physical space as well. So, but it is quite maths oriented. Whereas Montessori, of course, has programs to get you into the language and the social studies and world studies as well. They have in Montessori all of your what do you call them? The life works, right? Okay. Works of life, right? Yeah. Where you're pouring from one cup to another. Those sort of practical life, there it is. Those practical life works are this beautiful extension, whereas Froebel's is almost like if you were just in the math room of a Montessori classroom, it's a lot like being there.
Gotcha. So much more hands-on and play-based, but done so within the math lens, right? So here's a question that I know we're going to get, because we're going to hear from some educators who are like, well, it sounds like this is just for kindergarten or just for the littles. So how can we maybe modify some of Froebel's gifts into older students for teaching older students?
Yeah, you're right. A lot of this, I've had my great successes with the little kids because it was a kindergarten program. And so that's what I went ahead and was like, oh, well, I'll do it with the kindergartners. Then, I started it last few years. And when we had to close down the schools, we didn't get through the whole program. So we went to the first graders with the same objects and got just more out of it. Even when we started sewing with our first graders, now we're still in the little ages, aren't we? So when we came back and we had our sixth graders exploring things as well, I knew they didn't have the full breadth of their math curriculum from fifth grade. So when we went to make angles or in our mandalas or reflect things in our mandalas that we were creating, we were able to pull these toys out, right? And because they've never gotten this in kindergarten, those activities, those concrete activities where you have the object in your hands, were equally valuable to the older kids as they would have been for the younger kids. So if you've got a group of 8th graders or 10th graders that never got to take 2 sticks and move them from acute to obtuse angles, they're going to benefit from the exact same activity that you had your kindergartners do if you were using Froebel's gifts and examining angles. But you can get more fidelity, right? So instead of just perpendicular and parallel, those kids could be examining the whole breadth of angles that you can accomplish with 2 sticks next to each other. So that was a lot of 360 degrees, right? They also were really cool with the works of beauty are really quite complex. So each of these gifts has works of life that you can make. So you can make things look like, a train from real life, or you can make things that are abstract, beautiful designs. And the works of beauty are tricky. And my older kids really connected with those because it was more like building a mosaic if you were using cubes, or it was more like creating the outline of perimeter of a building and finding its area when they were using the rectangular prisms. And it was more like constructing these very complex shapes when they were using their triangles, not just a trapezoid or a square, but going beyond that and getting stars and formations like that. So the older kids can just go further with these gifts, and they can also get some of those concepts in their hands rather than just, getting them first off with numbers. So the angles were a huge one. The complex shapes was a big one, and fractions was a big one. When you are working fractions with big kids, they benefit just as much from a fraction wheel as a little kid does. So definitely starting with something in their hands, and then you can give them numbers, and then they can start thinking in their brains.
Yeah. Well, and I think for anybody who's been intimidated by math, even adults, I mean, you ask the adults in a room, how many of you loved math as a kid? And I think you might get a spattering of hands, but not too many. And so, and where is it where people begin to get frustrated with math? It's fractions, right? It's in that aspect at grade 3, when we start to really look at fractions and understanding numerators and denominators. And if you can have something concrete to put in their hands, I think even adults can benefit from that in order to visualize and interpret and understand the process behind the fractions, right? So truly, everything we needed to learn, we learned in kindergarten.
And when you have the foundation early on, that can help, but it doesn't hurt to revisit, right? So if you learned your fractions with your Froebel's gifts in kindergarten, third grade, you're starting to put a number to it. It's like, I got to get my toys out again so I can break them in 2 and in 4, and then really understand what your numerator denominator is and all that. Yeah, it was funny. I was thinking of kind of just the math that we have through history. And our first math is just, the counting numbers or our whole numbers or whatever. And those all are so conversational. Even when you get into like fractions a little bit, that's all something that you can tell a story about, because those were all numbers that we made to tell people how much of something we had, or how much we owed somebody else, or how much got taken away. Like, that's just so naturally conversational. It comes up so easily for the kindergartens. And for the older kids as well, even just more complicated. But yeah, once you get to fractions, it's like, well, why would I cut my sheep in half or whatever? When you have your toys, out, you can really figure out, well, why would I ever need to know how many parts of a whole I had? Well, what if I had a toy that broke into 8 parts? I would need to know, right? So yeah, it makes it really more conversational, like all their first learning is, like all our first initial math is.
Yeah. And I think you bring up a great point about storytelling, because, it's the oldest art form, I think, with people, just being able to, we learn through story, right? And we don't often think about storytelling and math. So talk to me a little bit how you use storytelling and math as a natural pairing with visual art.
Absolutely. So with the kids involved in play, involved in construction and building things, they're talking to themselves, absolutely, in their own brains, or they're talking to their neighbor. And when the teacher can come around and drop in on that conversation, as they're building, they're using a lot of those, both there's telling a story like my little princess is climbing the tower, but also like this tower is much bigger than the other tower, which is only 2 blocks high. Well, the teacher can say, well, how much higher is the tall tower from the small tower? And build up their math concepts as they're just telling a story. So stories, like you said, that's how you learn. It's how you kind of express why math matters. It's how you express the differences between things and the similarities. And that kind of comparison with these tangible building tools in a kid's hand, it just is math. It couldn't not be math.
Have you ever wished that you could make arts integration a little easier? Maybe have some ready to go lesson plans that are going to be a surefire winner, or some elements of arts posters to help make that vocabulary just a little easier and something that's a familiar part of your classroom. Or maybe you need some PD hours and you'd love to learn more about arts integration, STEAM, how SEL works with arts integration. Then if this is you, I would love to invite you to join us in the Accelerator. The Accelerator is a one-stop shop for everything arts integration and STEAM. Inside, you're going to find 300 plus lessons that are ready to go, along with student assessments and materials of instruction. Everything is planned, ready, and all you have to do is click open and you've got it. It also has 300 plus resources in your library that you can print and use. Everything from planners to posters to checklists to assessments. Everything you could possibly want is available in that library. And speaking of libraries, we have a course library with 6 every month. So you're always going to find something new and fresh with PD hours that are going to count towards your requirements for salary advancement. So if that sounds like a game changer to you, join us over at artsintegration.com/accelerator. Plans start at just $37 a month. It's amazing. So when you're working with them in visual art, now, is this happening in their classroom? Is it happening in the art room, or is it both? How does that work for you?
We currently have it just in the art room. I'm piloting how this works in the art room, and just so everybody knows, it works awesome. It's the best. And we're starting to kind of lend in. As this year I've been on a cart and been in other people's classrooms using the gifts in other people's classrooms, they're starting to see, that's cool. Oh, can I borrow those? Or you are doing sewing with the kids? Let's do a sewing craft. And now I know how to, get them in order where we perforate first and then we sew. So we are kind of naturally, now that border is being blurred and we're able to pass those materials back and forth. This is something that absolutely, formally we ought to bring those 8 cubes over to the kindergarten teachers in their very first, days of school. And we absolutely should bring those 8 rectangles and teach them how to kind of curate those materials they either already have or the ones that I can bring them, so that they are already in a set that allows the kids to do that kind of comparison in a controlled environment, that they're getting those comparisons. Instead, if you give a kid 1,000 blocks, they're going to play, but are they really working within a whole? Maybe not, unless they can count to 1,000. But if you give them a set of, and then they're fine. But if you can give them a set of 8, can they work within that whole and understand it as a whole? Much easier. So curation is a huge part of this that we're definitely going to work a lot in the next few years with our kindergarten groups.
Yeah. Well, and I think you're doing organically what we share with educators all the time as best practice when it comes to arts integration and with STEAM, in that you're not telling, you're showing, you're kind of organically inviting classroom teachers in to see, like, here's what's happening. And, I'm a big believer that if people can come into a classroom and see or watch another teacher and what they're doing, the ideas start to fire in your brain and you start to make connections on, oh, I could use that here and oh, I can use that there. And that's really the power of integration, no matter what you're using, is being able to make those connections and then facilitate that with your kids. So I think the process that you're using is so wonderful, because it's inviting them in. You're not telling them, here's one more thing you got to do. It's exciting for them to see that, right?
Totally. I mean, it couldn't have been, I'm just thrilled to be in their classroom, which you wouldn't normally hear, oh, I love being on a cart with my art stuff everywhere and falling off in the hallways. But it has been absolutely thrilling to go into their classrooms and both see what they're up to and be like, oh my gosh, like this really does fit. I read the standards and they fit, but now I can see they have their counting cubes out and they're counting to 8. It's the perfect day for this. It's been amazing to go in there. It's really a weirdly awesome experience this year with all the constraints that there have been and all the weirdness that there's been. It has been the best pressure cooker for creativity in my curriculum, and I think for a lot of other teachers' curriculum as well.
Wow. That's so powerful. I love that. The best pressure cooker for creativity. Because you're right. Creativity happens when we are constrained. Oftentimes, that's when we have the biggest creative leaps, right? So what a wonderful experience for your teachers and for your kids this year. That's amazing.
And isn't it just a beautiful mirror of the gifts, right? We're constraining them to 8 blocks. And that seems mean, but it makes them creative. So yeah, I'm constrained to staying in this one spot or going to their classrooms, but it really helps.
Yeah. So I'm curious, your background. How did your background in math and digital storytelling and visual art lead you to this kind of an approach?
Absolutely. So the maths background, I am one of those people who would be like, I loved math. And I've recently started studying to get a certification in math education as well, so that I can just kind of get out there and see what's happening in the upper grades classrooms, what's happening with higher level math as well. And when I started getting into that education, really wonderful program at NJCTL, New Jersey Center for Teaching and Learning, they really focus a lot on having something concrete, even for older grades. They're doing algebra class, right, with these concrete manipulatives, then giving them some sort of, representational stuff, their numbers or whatever it is, or pictures, get it 2D. And then they really get them into their abstract thinking. They really talk about supporting the kids where they're at through their peer circle. Mm-hmm. Another thing that was like, oh, well, they're doing that in Froebel's gifts. When I heard about that, that's how it worked out there. the kids can tell each other, well, this is how I made my locomotive, or this is how I made my house, and model it for them right there in front of them. They don't need a teacher to dive in and show them how to make the house. Their peers can do it. Yeah. So a lot of peer teaching was in that same program. And that really made me recognize Froebel's gifts as the opportunity that it was, where I would have been like, oh, that sounds really cool. Let me just log that one in the back. Knowing that it was going to bring out the storytelling in kids, which is something, art can tell a story. We always teach that one. Knowing that it was bringing out storytelling in kids provoked me to make my first set of cubes. And even I started with those foam cubes that you can buy as math manipulatives as well. Started with those, said, let's see where it goes, and then it was like, well, this actually is quite successful. This is getting new stories out of the kids. It doesn't require them to have fine motor skills, so they don't have to be good drawers, quote unquote. But you can still access those imaginations and the stories that they want to tell. So having done a lot of digital storytelling with my older groups as well, and having constantly done storytelling with my younger groups in a traditional art classroom, knowing that I could add one beautiful object that would extract stories from kids who didn't have success on the computer, didn't have success with drawing. They had another mode that they could use, another tool they could use to find success.
Wow. I think that's key. And I'm struck by the fact that it sounds like your passion point was right at the intersection of these components. And you just kind of found the niche that you needed to unlock everything for your students, but also for you as a teacher, which I think is really empowering, right? Because you all can't see this, but I'm watching her face and she is smiling the entire time because you're filled with joy.
So psyched about this. I am so excited to share this. Absolutely. It's thrilling to get this kind of inspiration and to be able to share it with people. And it's absolutely thrilling to have this gift, to make a little Froebel's joke there. Yeah. This gift, just placed on your lap. You hear it on the radio. Podcasts are wonderful. Shout out to podcasts. We're on one, right? So yeah, it's thrilling to just hear something and say, this could work. Give it a shot. You never know.
Yeah, absolutely. So I always end with one last question for everybody. What do you think is the most important thing that educators could walk away with from this year?
Awesome question. I think it's what we just referred to earlier, right? We talked about how this is such a high pressure environment this year. Maybe not from our normal pressures like testing or the state or your administration. Everybody's kind of like, oh, we'll give you a little bit of a pass this year. But the pressure of like, I have to do things completely differently this year gave us an opportunity to really be creative about how we taught our curriculum and give ourselves kind of the opportunity, kind of this sort of free pass to say, well, it's not going to be like it always was. Mm-hmm. So how can I still give the kids a chance to express themselves the way they always did in this brand new way, in a way that works with going into classrooms, having minimal supplies, not having your cleanup sink, whatever it is. This is so accessible and so easy to clean up that it was, what I wanted to take away from this year and what I got from this year was that, being creative is your ticket to success in any environment, high pressure or low pressure, and being flexible and being able to make those creative choices on the fly is really what I got out of this year.
Wow. And with that, thank you so much, Ruth. This was an amazing interview. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Gosh, it was a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks for listening to the Artworks for Teachers podcast. This has been a production from the Institute for Arts Integration and STEAM. Be sure to tune in each Thursday for new episodes and head over to artsintegration.com/artworks to download the accompanying resources. And if you know another educator who could use creative inspiration, please share this with them. Together, we can make a difference in education today.